and can I welcome you here to this talk organised by the Speakers Advisory Committee on Works of Art. This is the first of a series relating to the First World War commemorations. I'm Howell Williams, I'm a member of that committee. Our speaker this evening is James Ford. James read Arts History at the University of East Anglia and has an MA from the Cotswold Institute. He is currently completing his PhD on the art of the political union in the House of Commons 1834 to 1928. His PhD studies are a collaboration between Parliament and Nottingham University. To take a seat. You haven't missed anything interesting. The Speakers Advisory Committee on the Works of Art, supported by the Curator's Office, are keen to encourage research on the Parliamentary Art Collection, of course. It increases the knowledge and the understanding of the collection and helps us manage it here, and make it relevant to the work of Parliament, disseminating information to the wider world through activities such as this talk, therefore is an important part of our work. I'm delighted to hear from James that the representation of Wales, in particular in this building, and this decoration is one of the areas of research that he's investigating, though St Andrew rather than St David is with us here tonight. And you'll be invited to have a look at him later on. If you do look around the back, he's very modern. He's got a backless dress on. James is going to concentrate on just one work of art for this evening, one which relates directly to his PhD, which is particularly appropriate to discuss in the context of the First World War centenary. So, over to James. We will have a question and answer session for the last 10 minutes or so, an hour.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Howard, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming along this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight and talk about the history of the Parliamentary War Memorial, which you can see on the screen here behind me. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the memorial, it stands in St Stephen's Porch, which is at the southern end of Westminster Hall, and was built, St Stephen's Porch was built by Charles Barry in the 19th century as part of the public entrance to his new Palace of Westminster. The stately, unassuming appearance of the memorial today hides something of a traumatic past, in which changing political concerns, changing artistic concerns, and both world wars had an impact. And it's this history that I'm going to be concentrating on this evening. Now, as Hal said, my interest in the memorial came through the research I've been doing for my PhD for the last 3 years, which looks at how the four nations of the United Kingdom are represented in the art and architecture of the Houses of Parliament during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Parliamentary War Memorial first came onto my radar because of the imagery of the UK that it includes and also that it included. Let me introduce you to St Andrew here. St Andrew was formerly part of the Parliamentary War Memorial, and I will come on to later to explain why he is no longer part of the memorial and why it is St Andrew alone that joins us here this evening. Let me just say for now that it has nothing to do with the recent referendum in Scotland or to do with the fact that it was St Andrew's Day on Sunday, although I think that is quite a happy coincidence. I'm going to begin by talking about the early history of the Parliamentary War Memorial during and after the First World War, and then move on to the subsequent history during World War II, and then finally conclude by bringing the story up until the present day. Now, in the years after the First World War saw a great wave of commemoration throughout the United Kingdom. Tens of thousands of war memorials were created in a really an unprecedented wave of commemoration which matched the unprecedented nature of the First World War itself. In communities throughout the country, war memorials were erected in cities, towns and villages, in hamlets, but also in sports clubs, educational institutions, religious institutions and places of work. And in this respect, Parliament was no different. There are in fact 6 First World War memorials within the Houses of Parliament, and these name 381 members of the parliamentary community who gave their lives in the First World War. The Parliamentary War Memorial was the first of Parliament's First World War memorials to be conceived, and it lists 145 individuals. There's 22 MPs, 20 peers, 9 senior members of staff known as officers, and 94 sons of MPs and officers of the House of Commons. The memorial itself, as I said, was the first to be conceived, and this was before the war itself had actually ended, when in July 1917, a self-constituted committee formed of MPs and peers, came together, and they unanimously decided to erect a suitable memorial to members and officials of both houses to honour the memory of those of our colleagues who had laid down their lives for their country. They applied to fellow members to subscribe to the memorial and raised £2,000. The first task that the Memorial Committee faced was where they should place the memorial. They initially considered placing it in Old Palace Yard, but this was considered not to be an appropriate location, and they finally alighted on St Stephen's Porch, where the present memorial is. The area that they chose was the screen which was beneath the Great South Window, and this was designed by Charles Barry, as I said, in the 19th century. The screen consists of a number of panels with Gothic tracery and with carved shields and crowns, and these are separated by pillars that have lions holding shields above them. And it was against this screen that the committee chose for the new war memorial to be placed. To find designs for the memorial, they approached three leading art world figures of the period. The first was Walter Tapper, who was a leading Gothic revival architect. Tapper was not successful on this occasion, but he did come to produce a number of war memorials throughout the United Kingdom, often in the form that architect-designed memorials took, which were large stone obelisks and crosses. The second person they approached was the sculptor George Frampton. Frampton was one of the leading British sculptors of this period. He was particularly known for his work in the new sculpture movement, which had emerged at the end of the 19th century as a reaction to the prevailing style of neoclassical sculpture. Like Tapper, Frampton was unsuccessful on this occasion, but he again became an extremely figure in war memorial history. He stood on an advisory committee set up by the Royal Academy to advise communities who were erecting war memorials, and he actually received one of the first commissions in the country for the Edith Cavell Memorial, which stands in St Martin's Place off Trafalgar Square. For the Edith Cavell Memorial, Frampton offered to do it for no fee, and when he submitted his design for the Parliamentary War Memorial, it came with the same condition. However, in this case, he said that if his design would be chosen, he wanted two young sculptors that were currently on the front fighting to come back and to execute the memorial in his place. And the third person they approached was another sculptor, Bertram Mackennal. Mackennal was born in Australia and first came to Europe in the 1880s, but it was really from the 1890s that he began to make his name. Unlike Frampton, he worked in a large number of styles, but it was really his versatility and his adaptability that made him so successful. And this was particularly true in the 1910s, when he became, in effect, the sculptor laureate to George V. He, in effect, had a monopoly on royal sculpture. Like many of the sculptors of this period, Mackennal's name is little known today, but he was an extremely important figure in his time. And you may not be familiar with his name, but you might well be familiar with some of his works. For example, if you leave tonight and head down Whitehall and look up at the Treasury building, you will see his great group on the facade. Or if you've ever seen any coinage or stamps, or indeed First World War medals, you would probably have seen the portrait of George V that Mackennal sculpted. Unfortunately, the designs produced by the three men do not survive. However, what we do know is that the War Memorial Committee considered that all three were so beautiful that they couldn't make up their mind. So they set up an advisory committee to help them with the choice. The members of the advisory committee were not part of the War Memorial Committee. They were chaired by Sir Alfred Mond, who was the first Commissioner of Works, and they were other members of Parliament who were considered to be experts in the field of the arts. The remit of the advisory committee was to select one of the three proposals and to make other proposals if they see fit, and to present the report to the members of the War Memorial Committee. Now, the War Memorial Committee evidently placed emphasis on the first part of that remit, which was to select one of the three proposals. However, the Advisory Committee ended up placing the emphasis on the second part. They concluded that the three designs that had been sought were not particularly impressive, and that new designs should be sought from new designers. They also concluded that the site chosen in St Stephen's Porch was not an appropriate position for the War Memorial, and even went so far as to employ their own architect to advise them where it should be put, suggesting that it should be placed on the terrace at the Lord's end of the building. Needless to say, the War Memorial Committee were not particularly happy that their advisory committee had in effect advised that the work they had done up until that period had been entirely pointless. So the committee was disbanded. but not before Sir Alfred Mond had fired a parting shot that as first Commissioner of Works, any subsequent design that was chosen had to have his permission to be built anyway. Now, as I said, none of the designs survive, but an early drawing of Mackennal's memorial does, and I think this indicates, well, why Mackennal's design may have been chosen over the others. So Mackennal's memorial originally consisted of simply this central section. The rest of the screen was left untouched as it had been designed by Barry and Pugin in the 19th century. Part of the reason I think Mackennal's design was successful was because he cleverly incorporated it into the existing structure. So, for example, the existing pillars here he utilised, but he removed the lions from the top and replaced them with bronze figures of the virtues of faith and fortitude. For the memorial panels themselves, he reproduced the Gothic tracery from the other panels, though he added shields that have the coats of arms of the different kingdoms of the United Kingdom. The central figure is a figure of a recording angel, who in the Abrahamic religions records the deeds of every person. The angel's wings spread out over the two memorial panels as if to protect them. Above the memorial is perhaps the most interesting feature. This pierced Gothic arch surmounted by a bronze statuette of St. George, while below it contained three niches with St. Andrew in the centre and St. David and St. Patrick on either side. I think that this feature was probably another one of the reasons that Mackennal's design was successful, because he was cleverly showing how the memorial was a memorial for the United Kingdom Parliament. He was also linking to existing parts of the building. These statues are on the exterior of the Palace of Westminster, and these were designed by John Thomas in the 19th century under Charles Barry's supervision. And on various facades of the outside of the building, Barry erected statues of the four national patron saints of the United Kingdom. So by including similar figures in his memorial, Barry was linking back to the existing structure of the building. Sorry, Mackennal was linking back to the existing structure of the building. The memorial as it was originally designed was installed over the Christmas recess in 1920. And these are the masons who installed it. These were not people from Mackennal's studio, but were masons from the company who provided the stone. You can see this mason here is chipping out some of the original Victorian decoration to enable the panels to be set into the screen. There's a couple of interesting things about these photographs that I just want to point out. I haven't quite yet been able to work out how this mason here on the right is managing to hold up this vast piece of Portland stone. The only thing I can think is that perhaps it's a wooden model to help them with the eventual size that it needs to be. But I don't see then why they would include every single name. So if anybody has any suggestions at the end, I'd be very happy to hear them. The same superhuman mason in this photograph appears to be making final alterations to the central figure of the memorial. Now, it's almost certain that only Mackennal or maybe his most senior studio assistants would have undertaken this work. And I'm pretty certain that the types of tools he's using are not particularly appropriate to the fine detail that he's attempting to carve anyway. So I think effectively these photographs are staged. But this was taken during the installation, and they're no less interesting for that. If we just return to the drawing I showed you a few moments ago, that was a detail. This is the entire drawing. This was actually produced when the memorial was subsequently extended along the full length of the screen. And you can see here how they planned for this to happen by removing the central mullion of the panel there and inserting a new stone panel that would be inscribed with the names on it. But why did they have to extend the memorial once it had already been constructed? Well, the simple reason was that there were a number of issues and problems that soon came out once the memorial had been installed. Firstly, a number of errors in the list of peers were discovered. Secondly, the two officers of the House of Lords who had died in the First World War were left off altogether. Now, this appears to have happened partially because in 1918, the peers had decided to erect their own war memorial. And this meant that the peers that had been involved in the Parliamentary War Memorial had no practical involvement in it after that. It effectively became the self-constituted committee, and it was dominated by the MPs who were on it, and among many people it even came to be called the House of Commons War Memorial. The planned Peers Memorial for Royal Gallery also raised a number of other issues. Firstly, it was pointed out that the definition of fallen in war used to define who should be listed on the Peers Memorial differed to that used for the Parliamentary War Memorial, which meant potentially that the two memorials, though ostensibly commemorating the same event, could include two different lists. The peers were also planning to commemorate the sons of peers on their war memorial, which raised the question, where would the sons of MPs be commemorated within the Houses of Parliament? So to address these issues, the War Memorial Committee decided to extend the memorial, and this drawing was produced as part of that process. However, before they could do that, another issue arose when they received a letter from staff in the engineering, maintenance, kitchen and refreshment departments complaining that members of staff from those departments who had died in the war had not been included on what was ostensibly a Parliamentary War Memorial. In this instance, the War Memorial Committee decided not to include the names on the memorial, but to create a separate memorial in Chancellor's Court, which they described as the domain of the workmen and staff to whom the memorial would refer. Justifying this, they explained that they had drawn a departmental division and that the Parliamentary War Memorial would list members of staff from the Sergeant-at-Arms and Clerk of the House departments and similar positions in the Lords who had died in the war, whilst members of staff from the other departments would be listed in Chancellor's Court. Now, needless to say, when Mackennal was informed that they were going to extend his memorial, he was not particularly happy and he expressed his regret that this was going to happen. But he nevertheless agreed to supervise whatever work they wanted to do. The new First Commissioner of Works, Lord Crawford, also expressed his fear that the original design would be spoiled and the balance would be all thrown out. However, the War Memorial Committee were determined to extend the memorial. So once the memorial had been extended, this is how it appeared. The new additions were relatively straightforward, and they listed the sons of MPs, sons of officers of the House of Commons. The one particularly interesting panel is this first one on the left, which I think of as something of an erratum. This panel effectively includes the original omissions from the Parliamentary War Memorial. So in the centre you have the two officers of the House of Lords who were originally left off, Robert Ambrose Court and George Leveson Gower. At the top, under the heading Members of the House of Commons Killed in the War, 3 additional names had also been added. And this seems to have been because the definition of fallen in war had been extended so that it had come into line with the Peers War Memorial, as 2 of those listed are noted as having died on active war service, though they didn't die in a theatre of war necessarily. This is slightly confused, however, by the fact that Charles Lyell, had actually stepped down from the House of Commons the year before he died, so he wasn't an MP when he was killed. The same was true of Thomas Kettle. Kettle had actually left the House of Commons in 1910, so he had ceased to be an MP for some period. Which would lead you to think that perhaps they included these names because these people were former MPs who had been killed in the war. However, there were other former MPs killed during the First World War that were not included. So the exact definition of fallen in the war that they took on remains something of a mystery. The name at the bottom is another interesting addition. This is Reginald Lanchbury, who is titled an officer of the House of Commons. Now, the addition of Lanchbury's name came about because of the departmental division that the War Memorial Committee had drawn in explaining why other members of staff couldn't be included. But Lanchbury, although he worked for the Sergeant-at-Arms Department, was not in the strictest sense an officer of the House of Commons, but a cleaner. However, because of this departmental division, he was in effect given a posthumous promotion on the memorial. So the memorial was finally completed and unveiled in 1922 in November. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, did the unveiling, joined by many members of Parliament and other dignitaries, including Herbert Henry Asquith, David Lloyd George, and the President and Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law. The choir of St Margaret's Church sang from the gallery above the memorial. We're very fortunate because we actually have some film footage of the unveiling, which, according to Pathé, was the first time that pictures, I assume they mean moving pictures, were ever taken inside the Houses of Parliament. whilst you're just watching this bit of silent footage, I'll read out something from the speech that the Prince of Wales said during the unveiling itself. "It is fitting that in this hall of Westminster, hallowed by the long ages in our country's history, there should stand a perpetual memorial of our country's greatest crisis. And in the years to come, there will pass and repass beneath these walls many destined to add further chapters to that history. It is no less fitting that they, as they go about the nation's business, should have in remembrance those valiant hearts to whom we do honour today. Their names are written here. To their lasting memory and undying fame, I dedicate this monument." So this marks the end of the first chapter in the Parliamentary War Memorial's history. To enter the next chapter, and to find out why St Andrew and his fellow patron saints are no longer part of the memorial, we need to move forward 18 years to London during the time of the Blitz in the Second World War, when at 12:10 a.m. on the 27th of September 1940, a large bomb exploded in Old Palace Yard. The bomb caused significant damage to the buildings surrounding Old Palace Yard, and in particular the Palace of Westminster. All of the windows on the west front were blown out. The statue of Richard the Lionheart, incidentally, was lifted bodily from its pedestal, bending the back leg of the horse and his sword in the process. But most interesting for us, really, is the damage that was caused to St Stephen's porch. And as you can see, the great window was destroyed. Pugin stained glass was smashed, and the masonry from the tracery fell into St Stephen's porch and rained down on the Parliamentary War Memorial. The Gothic arch that surmounted the memorial was knocked off, the angel was decapitated, and a number of the memorial panels themselves were also dislodged, uncovering some of the original Victorian decoration that they had been obscuring. Following the Second World War, a new joint war memorial committee was established, and they seem to have learned something of the lesson from the First World War Committee, and in this sense, this one was a true joint committee. It had an almost equal representation of MPs and peers. The party leaders were involved in its formation. It was chaired by the Speaker. It was altogether more representative. The aim of the committee was to commemorate Parliament's World War II dead, but they initially hoped to do this by modifying Mackennal's memorial when they restored it. And a number of different proposals to do this were put forward, such as adding large bronze panels either side of the Gothic arch, or setting the memorial right back underneath the window by removing the gallery, and then placing new panels either side in the space that had been created. And it was that last proposal that the War Memorial Committee went for. However, what they couldn't decide on was what should be done with the recording angel. Some members felt that it wasn't in keeping with the severity of Westminster Hall and that it should be entirely replaced by something else. Others felt that it should be left in its damaged state as a reminder of the trauma of war. So to help them with their decision, they approached the Fine Arts Commission, which had been established in 1924 to advise government departments on the arts. The Fine Arts Commission were unanimous that the angel itself should be restored, but in something of a replay of the First World War Memorial Committee's problem with their advisory committee, they discounted the scheme that the committee themselves had chosen, favouring a scheme that recut the original panels of the memorial to include the names of Parliament's World War II dead as well. And so this was in effect the proposal that they came up with. The memorial would be restored. These panels would list the names from the First World War, and then the Second World War would be added at the end. The War Memorial Committee were quite happy with this proposal, and they started to look for funds to commission it, and they worked out they needed £10,000, so they applied to fellow members for subscriptions. However, it soon became clear that they weren't going to raise that amount of money, so they altered their plans again. This time they went for a far simpler solution, which was to replace the destroyed window, Pugin's window that had been destroyed, with a World War II memorial window designed by Sir Ninian And this would mean that Mackennal's memorial would simply be restored. However, they soon realised that there would be an additional problem, which would be the Gothic arch on Mackennal's memorial would obscure their new war memorial window. I hope you can see that okay. So they drew up a number of schemes to show how, if the arch was replaced, from different areas in St Stephen's Porch and Westminster Hall, the new window would be obscured, concluding that the arch and its statuettes should not be reinstated. Further justifying this decision, they argued that, as well as obscuring the new window, the arch and the statuettes were an artistically undesirable part of Mackennal's memorial. However, this was obviously a huge decision to make and thing to do, so they reapproached the Fine Arts Commission asking for their advice once again. And the Fine Arts Commission this time agreed with them, saying that the aesthetic value of the memorial would not be unduly impaired if the cupola above the angel were to be removed. This might seem like a slightly odd decision to us today, but I think their priority was to create a World War II memorial whilst maintaining the integrity as a memorial of Mackennal's. And in this plan, the actual panels would not be harmed. It would simply be the arch on top that would be removed. It's also, I think, undeniable that by extending Mackennal's memorial in the early 1920s, his original design, as he had feared, had been entirely compromised. So by 1951, the overall structure of St Stephen's Porch had been restored to the extent that they could get on with the new window and with restoring Mackennal's memorial. And here you can see they're in the process of the panels have been replaced and the angel has begun to be restored, though the head has not been put back on, and the arch was never reinstated. One final decision they did make was to, although they reconstructed the memorial, they left some elements of the damage in place to show what they called the scars of war. And so finally in 1952, the memorial took on the appearance that we know it today. Comper's window was unveiled in that year, and here you can see it behind. And by that point, the Parliamentary War Memorial had been restored. But what happened to the statuettes of the saints, such as St Andrew? Now, unfortunately, the truth is that we don't really know. Their current location is unknown. They last feature in an inventory, a Ministry of Works inventory from the late 1950s. St Andrew then reappears on record in the 1970s, but at some point in that intervening period, the statuettes of St George, St David and St Patrick have left the building. So a search to locate them is ongoing, and there is some hope that perhaps by the centenary of the end of the war, which also marks 100 years since the memorial itself was commissioned, we may have learned their fate and perhaps we'll be able to reunite them here once again, even if only perhaps temporarily. So finally, just to finish, if you want to find out any more information about those named on the memorials I've been discussing today, which I haven't really spoken about, or on the other memorials throughout the parliamentary estate, and also Parliament's First World War centenary plans, I urge you to visit this website. Thank you very much indeed.